In the cruel heart of a Ming winter, inside a sealed palace where no sound escaped, they found her body, thin as a shadow, collapsed beside a bowl of cold water. She was Empress Chen Jiao, the abandoned wife of Emperor Zhengde. At 33, she did not die by sword or poison, but by silence. Starved, forgotten, until her heart ceased to beat. She was born in Nanjing, when the Ming Dynasty was still in the bloom of its power. The capital was a city of courtyards and ceremony, where the rhythm of life was measured not by seasons, but by ritual. In that world, a girl's worth was shaped by silence, grace, and obedience. Chen Jiao was the daughter of a modest official, neither too high to be noticed nor too low to be forgotten. Her family served the state with quiet loyalty, believing that virtue could shield one from the dangers of ambition. From childhood, she was trained in the arts of decorum. At dawn, she bowed before the ancestral tablets. At dusk, she practiced calligraphy under the dim glow of an oil lamp, tracing lines of Confucian virtue across sheets of pale silk. Her tutors taught her that the world of women was a garden enclosed. To flourish within, one must not reach beyond its walls. Her beauty was not the kind that struck with brilliance, but the kind that lingered, serene, composed, the calm of still water before a storm. The attendants in her household often whispered that her eyes looked as if they had already seen too much sorrow for her age. But she smiled softly, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that life, in the palace or outside it, was built upon endurance. When the imperial edict came announcing a new round of selection for palace maidens, her parents were both proud and terrified. The Ming court was a place of gold and blood, where a woman could rise to become empress or vanish without a trace. Yet duty demanded they send her. The imperial envoys noted her composure, her measured steps, her voice steady even as she answered questions about poetry and morality. She was chosen. In the spring of her 15th year, Chen Jiao crossed the gates of the Forbidden City. The first thing she noticed was not the grandeur, but the silence. A silence heavy with watching eyes. Every courtyard whispered rules. Every corridor smelled faintly of fear. She became one among hundreds of young women, each competing not for affection, but for survival. Yet Chen Jiao did not fight. She remained courteous, gentle, almost invisible. Her restraint was mistaken for purity, her humility for virtue. And so, the girl who wished only to serve became a vessel for imperial expectation, a living ornament in the theater of the throne. But in the stillness of her nights, as she gazed at the faint moonlight falling through the latticed windows, she wondered if heaven had already decided her fate long before she took her first breath. When Emperor Zhengde ascended the throne, he was a boy emperor, restless, playful, and already half captive to his own impulses. The ministers, desperate for order, urged him to marry a woman of virtue to balance his unruly nature. Among the candidates presented, Chen Jiao stood out not for beauty, but for serenity. Her calm demeanor promised stability. Her lineage, no political threat. The day of the imperial wedding was magnificent. Red silk draped across the palace gates, drums echoing like thunder, the air thick with incense. Yet beneath the spectacle, there lingered a strange quiet. The groom, detached and impatient, treated the ceremony as a formality. The bride, hidden beneath her heavy phoenix crown, knelt and bowed as she was instructed, feeling her spine tremble under the weight of the jewels. That night, the emperor drank heavily with his companions, leaving her waiting in the bridal chamber alone. The candles burned down to ash before she realized that marriage, for her, was merely another ritual of obedience. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The emperor seldom visited her chambers. He preferred the company of jesters, musicians, and courtesans, the noise of freedom over the restraint of responsibility. In the inner palace, the empress's role was both sacred and hollow. She presided over ceremonies, oversaw the conduct of concubines, and smiled through layers of etiquette that masked her isolation. When she appeared before the court ladies, her face was serene, her words gentle. But when she was alone, she would sit by the lattice window, watching the snow melt over the stone courtyard, whispering prayers that even heaven seemed too distant to hear. She learned early that, in the Ming court, love was not a gift. It was a liability. So she buried her longing beneath composure, her sadness beneath ritual. And in doing so, she became precisely what the empire demanded: a perfect empress, untouched by desire, unseen by compassion. Little did she know that perfection in that palace was not protection. It was a sentence. The seasons passed within the walls of the Forbidden City, but to Chen Jiao, time had lost its rhythm. Days were measured not by the sun, but by silence. Each morning she awoke to the sound of eunuchs sweeping the corridors, their brooms brushing against stone like whispers of ghosts. Her attendants bowed low, speaking only when spoken to. Even the courtyards seemed to avoid her presence. Emperor Zhengde had long ceased to visit her quarters. He was consumed by his pleasures, hunting in forbidden forests, sailing on the artificial lakes he built within the palace, drinking with his inner circle of eunuchs. Rumors of his escapades reached every corner of the court. Drunken feasts, costumed masquerades, and the invention of an alternate persona he called the General Zhu. He wanted to be anyone but an emperor. For Chen Jiao, this absence became her cage. Her life was a ritual of repetition, rising before dawn, offering incense at the ancestral altar, reviewing documents of court etiquette she was no longer asked to enforce. Her meals were brought in silence. Her letters to the emperor were never answered. In her solitude, she turned to art. She painted small scenes on silk, plum blossoms against snow, cranes standing alone by frozen lakes, a reflection of her own existence. Sometimes, she whispered verses of old poems to herself, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. The concubines pitied her at first, then began to fear association. In the treacherous hierarchy of the palace, pity was dangerous. Affection could be misinterpreted as conspiracy. Soon, she was left entirely alone, her name fading from conversation, like an echo dying in a vast hall. At night, she would walk barefoot through the cold tiles, her reflection flickering in the bronze mirrors. "A wife to the Son of Heaven," she once murmured, and yet unseen even by the moon. She wrote to her mother once, through a trusted maid, confessing that she felt as if she had been buried alive within walls painted with gold. But the letter was intercepted by palace officials. It never left the Forbidden City. Her only solace came from watching the plum trees in her courtyard bloom each spring. Their pale petals reminded her that beauty could still exist in desolation. Yet even those petals, when they fell, seemed to whisper her fate, a gentle death, unnoticed, beneath the cold earth of power. It began with laughter, a sound the Empress had almost forgotten. From beyond the vermilion walls, she heard it. Bright, youthful, careless laughter, echoing through the imperial gardens. It belonged to a new concubine, a girl the Emperor had met during one of his excursions disguised as a commoner. Her name was Lady Zhang, but the court began to call her Saintly Consort Fayan, a name that blended sanctity with seduction. Fayan was everything Chen Jiao was not: lively, daring, irreverent. She danced for the emperor beneath lantern light, poured his wine with laughter in her eyes, and whispered secrets that made him forget his crown. Where the empress represented stillness, Feiyan embodied movement. Where Chen Jiao was the ritual, Feiyan was the rebellion. Soon, the emperor began to spend nearly all his time in Feiyan's quarters. He built new pavilions for her, gifted her silks and jade, and even allowed her to sit beside him during private banquets. A scandal to the officials, who dared not speak. The court trembled beneath this new order. Ministers who had once bowed before the empress now aligned themselves with the consort's faction, offering tributes and flattery to secure their survival. The eunuchs, sensing the shift in power, began to exclude the empress from palace matters. Chen Jiao observed it all with calm despair. She did not rage, she did not plead, but her silence made her an easy target. Feiyan, emboldened by her favor, began to whisper poison. That the empress practiced witchcraft, that her prayers were curses, that her calm was deceit. The emperor, ever suspicious of what he could not understand, began to listen. The old ministers who defended the empress were dismissed one by one. The name Chen became taboo, spoken only in whispers, followed by cautious glances. And so, while Feiyan's laughter filled the palace, the empress's world grew quieter still. One evening, as snow fell outside her sealed windows, Chen Jiao gazed into the distance and said softly to her attendant, "There will come a day when even my silence will be called treason." The attendant, frightened by her words, begged her to rest. But the empress only smiled, a sad, knowing smile, as if she had already seen the shadow of her own erasure forming on the palace walls. By the year 1515, the court had become a battlefield disguised in silk. Behind the painted screens and perfumed corridors, alliances were made and broken with the same cold precision as military campaigns. Every whisper could end a life. Every gesture could be twisted into evidence of betrayal. It was during this tense winter that the first accusation appeared. A rumor, quiet and deliberate, seeded by consort Feiyan's circle. They claimed that Empress Chen Jiao had turned to witchcraft, using talismans and secret incantations to curse the emperor's health. The idea was absurd. Chen Jiao had long abandoned any hope of attention from the throne. Yet, in the Ming court, logic mattered less than fear. The eunuchs, eager to please the emperor and the new favorite, began their investigation. Servants were interrogated, her chamber searched. A few pieces of embroidered silk bearing Buddhist sutras were presented as evidence of her dark arts. When shown the objects, Chen Jiao simply bowed and said quietly, "If prayer is a crime, then heaven itself is guilty." But the emperor, now deep in his paranoia, saw in her calmness not dignity but defiance. His eyes, once indifferent, turned cold. The officials who might have defended her remained silent, unwilling to risk their positions. A decree was issued. The empress was to be stripped of her title and confined indefinitely. There was no trial, no farewell audience. The palace scribes wrote the command in gold ink on white silk, sealing her fate with strokes that glittered under candlelight. When the guards came for her, she did not resist. She removed her phoenix crown herself, set it on the table, and then whispered to it as though it were a living thing. "You were made to shine under heaven's gaze, but even light can be buried in darkness." As they led her away through the long corridors, the snow outside had begun to fall again, covering the red stones with a white silence. Not a single court lady came to see her off. The grandest woman in the empire vanished into the shadows of her own palace, and by dawn, her name had already been erased from the daily records. That night, Fayan hosted a feast. Music echoed through the same walls that now enclosed Chen Jiao's captivity. For every toast raised in celebration, the Empress's memory sank deeper into oblivion. The empire had no need for a dethroned empress. It needed only the illusion of harmony. The place of her confinement was known as Jingren Palace, once a residence for favored consorts, now a prison for the disgraced. It was said that the walls there absorbed voices, that no cry or prayer ever escaped them. Her room was bare. A low wooden bed, a cracked bronze mirror, and a single window barred with iron lattice. The guards stationed outside were forbidden to speak to her. Even her personal maids were replaced by silent attendants who left her food without looking up. At first, Chen Jiao tried to live by routine. She continued her morning rituals, bowing before an invisible altar, whispering prayers into the still air. But her meals grew smaller each day, first rice, then porridge, then only water. The eunuchs claimed they were following orders from above. The empire cannot afford generosity to a traitor, one said without meeting her eyes. As days turned to weeks, hunger hollowed her body. Her hands trembled when she tried to write, yet she still carved words into the wall with a hairpin. No one hears the hunger of a forgotten soul. Her reflection in the mirror changed. The once serene empress became a specter. Her cheeks sank, her lips cracked, her long hair fell in clumps onto the cold floor. The silence grew so thick that even her breath seemed a disturbance. In the night, she dreamed of her home in Nanjing. Her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, the scent of plum blossoms in spring. She would wake to the sound of dripping water from the roof, her dream fading into the damp chill of reality. Sometimes, she whispered to the guards through the door, "Tell me if the emperor still lives." No one ever replied. Her only companions were the rats that crept in from the corners, searching for crumbs she did not have. She began to feed them what little she could, speaking to them softly, calling them her little courtiers. And then came the final cruelty, the order to cut her food entirely, under the pretext that she had refused sustenance. Starvation set in quietly, like a second skin. Her vision blurred, her heartbeat slowed. Still, she clung to one last act of dignity. With the blood that pooled from her cracked lips, she wrote a final line upon the wall. "If heaven watches, let it bear witness that silence can kill." The next morning, the attendants found the writing but said nothing. They washed the wall clean before the sun rose, erasing the last trace of her defiance. In that empty room, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the palace had agreed to forget she ever existed. The months that followed became a blur of cold and emptiness. No one in the Forbidden City spoke her name anymore. The officials who once addressed her with ceremonial reverence now avoided even glancing toward her sealed quarters. In the empire's vast machinery, Empress Chen Jiao had ceased to exist. The eunuch assigned to deliver her food reduced the portions until only a handful of rice remained. He was told that such measures were necessary to maintain discipline. In truth, he did not care. To him, she was not a woman, but a burden. Another secret to be managed. Another shadow to be erased. Inside the silent palace, the Empress's world shrank to the width of her room. Her voice grew faint, her steps slow, her thoughts heavy like winter fog. She counted days by the faint light filtering through the barred window. Sometimes, when snow fell, she pressed her hand against the cold glass, tracing the melting patterns with a weak finger. It was the only movement she could still control. Her attendants, forbidden to speak, communicated through gestures. They left her water that was half frozen, rice that had gone stale. Yet she thanked them with a nod each time, her lips too dry to form words. At night, she listened to the sound of the wind clawing at the eaves. It howled like a voice from another world. A voice that reminded her she was still alive, if only barely. The emperor, meanwhile, had grown weary of palace politics and withdrew deeper into his hedonism. To distract himself, he ordered the construction of pleasure gardens and artificial lakes, pretending to be a commoner on grand adventures. When the ministers asked about the empress, he merely waved his hand. "She is well. She prays for me." In the cold cell of Jingren Palace, Chen Jiao did pray, but not for him. She prayed for release, for the wind to carry her name beyond those walls. "Let one person remember," she whispered to the darkness, "that I once lived." Her strength faded slowly. Hunger blurred her mind, turning days into hallucinations. She saw her mother again, standing by the river in Nanjing, calling her home. She saw her younger self, running barefoot through spring fields, laughing without fear. The visions comforted her, even as her body betrayed her. One evening, she heard footsteps approaching, deliberate, echoing, unfamiliar. She tried to rise, expecting perhaps a messenger or a priest. But it was only the eunuch again, delivering nothing. He opened the door just enough to look inside, then shut it quickly, muttering to himself, "Still alive." When he left, she whispered, almost smiling, "Not for long." And then, for 3 days, there was nothing. No food, no sound, no light. The palace had decided that silence would finish what cruelty had begun. In the stillness, her body grew lighter, her breath shallower, her pulse fading into the quiet rhythm of death. The wind outside sighed through the cracks of the window frame, like a requiem that only she could hear. By the time winter reached its deepest frost, the guards outside Jingren Palace had stopped checking on her. Their orders were to watch the door, not the woman behind it. On a pale morning, one of them noticed that no sound came from within. No cough, no rustle of fabric, no faint shuffle of movement. Hours passed, and unease grew. Finally, the chief eunuch ordered the door opened, if only to confirm what everyone already suspected. The hinges groaned as the frozen air rushed in. Inside, the room was dim and lifeless. The empress lay on the stone floor, her body curled as if in prayer. Her fingers still touched the rim of an empty bowl. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes half open, not in terror, but in exhaustion, as though even death had taken pity and come gently. The attendants stood in silence. No one dared to speak her name. The eunuch glanced at the corpse and said flatly, "Write it down. Illness." The scribe obeyed, dipping his brush into ink that froze upon the bristles. On the record of imperial deaths, it was written, "Deposed Empress Chen died of sickness." No priest was summoned, no mourning bells rang. Her body was wrapped hastily in plain cloth, carried out through a side gate before dawn. The cold wind swept through the corridor, lifting strands of her hair that had escaped the shroud. They glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The last trace of a woman who had once worn the phoenix crown. Some said the guards who removed her body never spoke again. Others claimed that at night, when the torches flickered, they could hear faint knocking from the walls of Jingren Palace, as if someone still lingered there, asking for water. In the emperor's private chambers, the news was delivered in a single sentence. He nodded, expressionless, and returned to his wine. "May she find peace," he murmured. the only prayer he ever gave her. Outside, snow continued to fall. It covered the palace roofs, the courtyards, the very path where her body had been carried. By dawn, there was no trace left, only whiteness, vast and indifferent. No one built her a tomb. No offerings were made in her name. She became a shadow erased by decree, her story reduced to a single line in a forgotten record. Yet within the frozen air of the palace, something remained. The silence she had endured had seeped into the walls themselves, lingering like frost that never melts. And sometimes, when the winter wind swept through the forbidden city, the servants would swear they heard a woman's whisper, faint, trembling, almost prayer-like. "Do you hear me now?" When the report of her death reached the inner court, the ministers reacted with rehearsed solemnity. None dared to question the circumstances. The decree was drafted within an hour. Former Empress Chen, long afflicted by illness, has passed away peacefully. Her virtue shall be remembered. It was read aloud in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the emperor listening with detached calm. His face, pale under the lantern glow, betrayed no grief. He raised a cup of wine, toasted the silence, and said, "Let there be no mourning rituals. We must not disturb the order of heaven with old sorrows." The courtiers bowed deeply. None spoke. The scribes sealed the decree with the imperial seal, and just like that, history was rewritten. Outside the palace, however, whispers began to spread. Servants who had worked near Jingren Palace spoke in secret of a woman starved, of blood-stained walls, of prayers that had gone unanswered. The emperor's silence only deepened the rumors. Some said that when the empress died, her body had been so light they carried her in a single sheet of cloth. Others swore they saw a flicker of her reflection in the palace ponds at night, a thin figure in white kneeling beside the water, her lips moving soundlessly. The stories grew, passed from servant to servant, from city to city, until the people began to call her the Hungry Empress. To them, she was not a traitor nor a forgotten consort. She was a symbol of injustice, of what happens when power devours compassion. The imperial court tried to suppress these tales. Guards were sent to question those who spoke her name. But truth, once whispered, is harder to silence than any decree. Years later, even as new emperors sat upon the throne, the legend persisted. Mothers warned their daughters of palace life, telling them that gold could turn to chains and love could become poison. In taverns, poets recited forbidden verses about a woman who died for silence, her hunger echoing through centuries. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, travelers passing near the old palace ruins claimed to hear the sound of bare feet walking behind the walls. "It is her," they said, still searching for the warmth she was denied. The empire never issued a correction. The official histories mention her only once, a single line buried among records of concubines and feasts. Deposed, died young. But the people remembered her differently. To them, she was the queen who spoke without sound, whose suffering revealed the cruelty of the throne. And so, while the court's marble walls gleamed under the sun, the truth lay buried beneath, like bones beneath ice, waiting for time to thaw their story free. Empress Chen Jiao did not die because of rebellion or sin. She died because no one listened. Her fate was sealed not by violence, but by neglect, the slowest, most merciless form of execution. In the chronicles of power, silence is often more lethal than the sword. It erases names, memories, entire lives, without spilling a single drop of blood. She was buried in an unmarked grave, yet her story outlived the empire that tried to hide it. In every tale told about her, there lingers a single, haunting truth, that in the heart of absolute power, compassion was the first to starve. And somewhere, within the wind that sweeps across the abandoned courtyards of the Ming palaces, a faint voice still calls, "Do you hear me now?"